Hello and welcome to another episode of our Thought Leaders series with Student Garden. Today I'm joined by the wonderful Kim Watty. Kim, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here, George.
Kim, I was doing a little bit of research on your experience and your background. Very, very impressive. I'm going to try to do it a little bit of justice in terms of what experience you've had, but reading about it, obviously you've had 30 years plus experience kind of working in the higher education industry. You're currently an Emeritus Professor, Department of Accounting at Deakin University, and currently the chair of Deakin College and also the chair of Hilltop Institute as well. So welcome.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps a good place for us to start, as I kind of mentioned at the top, you've obviously had a number of years experience. I'm sure you've seen things come and go and change and evolve. I'd love to sort of tap into, I suppose, what you think are some of kind of the trends that you've kind of observed more recently and how the higher education sector is really evolving, in 2024.
Yeah. The obvious answer to that question is around AI and technology and how that has actually changed the way that we design and deliver a curriculum. But I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen, and I think that will continue, is the use of technology to open access for higher education to diverse students or diverse participants. So online learning is one of the fastest growing cohorts of enrolments in Australian universities. And I think that technology has allowed us to provide opportunities for students to learn that previously may have not been able to come onto campus. So perhaps parents doing a second degree, mothers and fathers at home with children, people who are coming back to do a first, second or third degree. So that technology certainly allows additional access to people. Technology also allows students and learners to be able to access education across the world.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting, when you think about 3-year undergraduate degrees or 2 years masters, learners are now saying, what's the return on investment for that? Do I really want to invest 3 years of my time in a college, pay fees for that privilege? And when do I get my return on investment? So education now has become more flexible, more accessible, and some students will curate their own learning. Some of our better students may come and do a certificate. They may do 4 units or 8 units at a university, and then they'll go off and do something else, perhaps something from MIT or Harvard, an online course. Perhaps some volunteering. They just really understand that it's really filling out the whole profile of the person that is going to give them access to the jobs of the future that they may want, whether they're in profit, not-for-profit, whatever that might be. So, I suppose in summary, of course, technology and AI is absolutely changing education. But I think in higher education particularly, it's the opportunities for access to learners and what that provides them in terms of diversity of learning for them.
Yeah. And obviously I know, COVID obviously massively accelerated online learning. When you kind of think about it from a, teaching perspective and learning outcomes perspective, how much of that, I guess, environment is kind of designed for purpose? Like because, being in a classroom environment versus learning online, it's very different. So are universities really changing the way they actually design the teaching, and the learning to suit that kind of online environment? And is that treated very differently?
The response is some.
Yeah.
For many during COVID, they considered online learning to be a video of a lecture, a 1-hour lecture on online for students to learn, and then we'll use the tutorial questions that were previously all face-to-face. So the universities who pride themselves on being educators using an online environment, they know that the pedagogy and curriculum design around online learning is vastly different to face-to-face.
Yeah.
So there are still some universities and higher education providers who say they have online learning, but it's little more than the face-to-face videoed and put online. No regard for the difference in pedagogy around how you engage students in an online environment, how you get them to be active participants in an online environment. So some universities are doing very well. The universities who thought they were online providers during COVID are now recognising that it doesn't really cut the mustard with students if they're not getting an online education that really is fulfilling those learning outcomes. And
it's interesting, I think as we kind of see more of the rise, I guess, of technology and, personalised learning delivered, whether it's delivered through the assistance of AI. I think the importance of that, the community kind of within the universities is what's going to become increasingly important. I know in speaking with a lot of international students, obviously a big part of coming here is, being involved in student associations and getting that sense of kind of community. So I think, there's going to be a lot of more emphasis and effort put on the things that sit kind of around the learning itself to ultimately get a better outcome is sort of what I'm hopeful for.
Yeah, and I think, you talk about community and I sort of sometimes think of the higher education ecosystem, and something else that I think has started to happen in the last decade and will continue to happen is universities recognising that on their own they are not necessarily the best provider of education. Mm-hmm. And I've done some presentations around partnerships. And I say, and to use a well-worn phrase, they say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I think it takes a community both in the tent and outside the tent to be able to educate a learner appropriately. Yep. So, inside the tent we have our normal student supports, but we really want inside the tent partnerships with organisations like ed tech companies. Yep. They're the experts. They can actually help us to develop appropriate learning resources. With professional bodies, let's get them involved in partnerships and curation of curriculum. With employers, graduate employers, we tend to think that our students can go and get an internship job pretty quickly. Well, employers don't do that anymore. That was 30 years ago. You could place every student. We now have more students. We have diverse students. Working with businesses to co-create assessment, to get them involved in assessment of students. That's really how students are going to get exposed to different types of cohorts. And that ecosystem is so much more than just the university, and the best universities are bringing in those other partnerships.
Yeah, I had the pleasure recently of doing a guest lecture at the Melbourne School of Business, and, it was really, I got so much energy out of just being able to come in and speak to these students they were studying their Masters of Entrepreneurship. And, the kind of engagement and excitement kind of in my story and my journey, like I got so much out of that by just being out, like, someone just reached out to me and invited me along to come and do that. And, I think there's probably a whole bunch of people in my shoes who would love the opportunity to be able to kind of to give back and be able to kind of do that, because we get heaps out of that as entrepreneurs and getting energy from people who are kind of coming through. So
I'm smiling because I think, and I know it's in the past, but 20 years ago there'd be academics who said, well, no, it's my responsibility to develop and deliver this particular course. And if I get someone in from a professional body, I'm abrogating my responsibility. Seriously, there was that thought. Yeah. And it's all contextualised, so it's not a criticism. It's just a reality that, 20 or 30 years ago, the academic felt they had the responsibility for the full learning. And as you say, students love hearing from people who are actually walking the walk. So getting more people involved, and professional bodies, employers, they rarely say no.
Exactly.
They rarely say no, because they say exactly what you said. They get as much out of it as the students do. It's great.
And I think about, we've got an internship program at Student Garden called the Sprout program, and it's basically a 12-week sort of program. They do 2 to 3 days a week, and we kind of go through 4 different kind of key areas: campaign management, account management, design, and content creation. And we've hired, we've probably had, I reckon, maybe 20, 25 people kind of go through that over the past 6 years. We've hired like 25% of those people.
Exactly. You can look at them early.
I know. So it's
cost saving for you. You've got the right people and they look at you. Yeah.
And the ability to, form emerging leaders through that program as well, because, the people who are running that program now are people who did it previously. It's such a great opportunity for them to kind of develop leadership skills. So perfect. I totally agree with, that, like from our firsthand experience, that ability to kind of partner, with universities and training organizations is kind of such a huge opportunity. And I think, it's, I often think, well, we often think it's kind of those, like it's the city of Melbourne, it's these large organizations, but it's kind of, I imagine it's like, how do you kind of engage with businesses and community organisations at different levels is probably a big part of the challenge.
And it's about the win-win perspective. So it's about inviting people in to work with the students, and there is a win for them as well, because often they can see the types of students that are around. They offer them internships. There's a saving there. So it's always about, that collaboration is really very important, so that the people who come in to work with our students also see the benefit for them. And there has to be a benefit for them as well. I think it works both ways.
Totally. A few years ago, when you were at Deakin, you led the accreditation of the AACSB and EQUIS accreditations. Yep. I don't know too much about these accreditations, but I understand it's quite the undertaking to be able to do this. So would love to kind of, hear about that experience.
Sure.
And like, if you can give us a little bit of background kind of on the accreditations and tell us about the experience of kind of going through the process of doing this in in an organization that's obviously got a lot of layers and a lot of history in it to kind of get through to the other side.
So AACSB and EQUIS accreditation, EQUIS. AACSB is a US accreditation for business schools, and EQUIS is a European accreditation for business schools. And we did it at the university I was at Deakin, where I'm an Emeritus professor. We did it about 10 years ago. It's a bit like a club that you are more noticed if you're not in the club than being in the club. So AACSB, we have probably over 30 business schools are accredited. EQUIS is a little bit less, but it's really about accountability and providing evidence around curriculum delivery, research and impact. So it's about developing strategic plans, performance measures, student support, your retention policies, and it's about evidencing the work you're doing with documentation. That's really very important. So accreditation is all about the plan. What are you going to do? How did you do it? What were the outcomes? And a big part of it is this continuous improvement philosophy.
Yeah.
So lots of business schools would tend to say, we get students, we get the best students because of X, Y or Z, and we keep them here because they love it and blah, 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 whatever it might be. Yeah. So it's about putting evidence around that, which we haven't always been good at business schools or universities. We do what we do because we're good. And how do you know you're good? Because we know we're good.
Yeah.
How do you know it's a quality program? Well, I'm the academic and I know quality when I see it, and we're a bit more realistic these days. So big undertakings for schools. It's an expensive process in terms of years. So 3 years in the journey to get AACSB, same again for EQUIS accreditation. It's a journey that brings along everybody. So busy academics will say, not my problem. Professional staff do accreditation. I do the research and the teaching. That doesn't work. Yeah. Accreditation is everyone's job.
On board,
Exactly. And that's the hardest part I found was probably making sure that people felt they were part of the journey. Accreditation in the end becomes business as usual.
Yeah.
So it's not something that if you hide under your desk, it's going to go away. It keeps on coming back every 5 years. So it's not going anywhere. But I have to say, I think accreditation in business schools has been a fabulous thing because it's made us reflect on what we do, why we do it, why we're different to the institution up the road, and particularly how students benefit from the education that we provide, their employment opportunities, the impact of their education. So I'd say overall a really good process. And I am still involved with AACSB. I mentor a couple of Indian business schools who again are going through the journey 3 or 4 years to actually get the tick.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'd probably say is we used to talk about, and I think we should talk about accreditation as the lag indicator. So if you have quality and standards in your operations, then you get a tick at the end, which is accreditation. If you put it the other way around and accreditation drives these things, it kind of gives the wrong perspective because people think they're doing work for accreditation. We're doing work because we want to have a high quality, high standard program to benefit our students. And if we do that and we can evidence it and tell some people the story, you'll get the tick that says you're accredited for 5 years, and then we go back and do it all again. So it's a it's a gift that keeps giving.
Wonderful. I've had the benefit of working with a couple of your wonderful mentees here at Student Garden. I know in speaking with them, you've got a very strong reputation, for the advocacy and mentorship of female leaders across the higher education sector. Would love to kind of hear from you, I guess, how are we kind of going across the kind of Australian higher education sector in terms of promoting kind of equality and, creating equal opportunities for both, our female and male colleagues. And I guess, what you think kind of needs to be done to kind of drive, better outcomes and more opportunities for kind of women across the higher education space.
Yeah, thanks for those nice things, and that's really nice to hear people feel that way. I think I'm very much an informal mentor, and it usually has been with young female academics or professional staff members. I probably didn't start mentoring sort of till I was in my 40s, and I sort of felt that conversations became a bit more formal and we formalised the meetings and what we wanted to do, etc. One of the interesting things that I found when I had a meeting of female academics, with a group of people, and we just wanted to talk about career and what was working and what wasn't, was realising that in the room we had females, so we had diversity across gender, across ethnicity, across income levels. And I really started to understand that a woman from a different ethnic background that is working with 4 children at home and doesn't have family support is such a unique profile. It's not just the female, it's not just the gender, It's everything else. I mean, I think that's really important. We're getting better at understanding that it's not just about gender, it's about diversity. But look, I think I didn't have a mentor as such, and when you haven't had a mentor, you think I didn't really need one. But I think it would have been helpful in some ways. I think opportunities for, I'll say, people from diverse backgrounds, so that includes ethnicity, culture, gender. I think there is definitely greater recognition around equity, diversity and inclusion. That's true. We've started to at least develop strategies which may mean something or may not. It's the starting point. Awareness is high. I think there are opportunities. When I look back, I think there were areas where unconscious bias came to the fore. So whether it's in meetings and someone may speak over you, whether it's 3 people in the meeting actually regurgitating what you have already said, and we can call it man-speak. We can call it a lot of other things as well. And I think for, let's say, people from diverse backgrounds, just being cognizant that can occur puts you in a better place. So I think it's worthwhile doing a bit of unconscious bias reading. I don't know about investing millions of dollars that universities do, and they say they've ticked a box and they're now all, they're all now all aware of the issues. That's not true. But I think it's useful for anyone to do a bit of reading about equity, diversity and inclusion, and just being aware and on the lookout for anything that they think that may not be right. So as I got older, if someone started to regurgitate what I'd already said, and it was usually a white Anglo-Saxon older man, that's a fact, I would tend to say, I think that's what I just said. Yeah. And then just hope nobody said anything else. But
good on you.
That takes a bit of courage.
Yeah, I was going to say that
definitely
takes courage, so good on you.
But you do it a couple of times and people recognise. And if I chair a meeting and someone has said something and then there are other people who start repeating it, I will say, thank you for your contributions, unless there's anything new. And if someone starts to repeat the same thing again, I'll say, I don't think that's adding, let's move on. Yeah. So that's moving off the diversity a bit.
No, but I think it's very relevant in terms of the unconscious bias.
It is. So it's being aware of it. And the last time I'd say for people from diverse backgrounds, including gender diversity, is don't look for validation. If I reflect back, I think I looked for validation from what was usually older white males. That was just the structure I was in. I was an accounting academic. 30 years ago, there weren't that many females. Oh, the best bit of advice I'd give to anyone around leadership or around sort of diversity is don't seek validation from others. Have the confidence to know in your heart you're doing the right thing, and you don't need someone to say, this is the job for you, Kim, go for it.
Absolutely.
Don't wait for it. Don't wait for it. Just do it.
I'm not surprised. I've heard the feedback I have now listening to you to talk about, and hindsight, it's easy to kind of look back and say, oh, well, it's kind of like that seems obvious, but I can only imagine how challenging it would have been to kind of go through that process, particularly when you're kind of a minority in that type of environment, so you really got to just stand up for yourself and kind of go for it.
And the interesting thing I have to say, George, is you make me sound very brave, but for years I don't think I recognised it, which is why when I was in my 40s and I did a bit more, I led some work around developing diversity, equity and inclusion strategy for the Deakin Business School, and I started thinking about the past. So I didn't recognise it at the time, so I wasn't feeling put upon or whatever it might be. That said, I think people now do recognise at a younger age. They're not waiting till their 40s. My 30-year-old daughter talks about it now.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I wasn't as brave as I may sound, but once I started to get a bit of courage, bravery kind of builds on itself.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. And staying on the topic of diversity and inclusion, when we look at the representation of Indigenous Australians kind of in university here they are underrepresented. What do you think, are some of the things that universities can be doing, and just like us as a community, as a society, what are some of the things we can kind of be doing to, I guess, help close that gap and get more of these fabulous kind of Indigenous people into our universities and studying higher education to create kind of more opportunities for them and their communities?
Great question, and I'm not an expert on the topic, but if I just think about, as you suggested, minority groups and coming into education, I think universities particularly have learned over the last 20 years about the importance of partnering with Indigenous groups, with Indigenous educators, with Indigenous elders to understand what education means for our Indigenous folk. Previously, when I was at a couple of universities in Melbourne, there was some pride in saying we have an Indigenous business program.
Yep.
And we get the students to come and live on campus for 6 months and then they go back home. Well, that didn't quite work because that wasn't appropriate for those students to come, leave their homes, come onto campus.
Yep.
So retention was really low. I mean, it was really difficult. But I think we've learnt, and there is now more opportunity where educators will go out from university, will go out to communities to provide education. Still a long way to go. Oh, my goodness. When you look at the numbers, they're pitiful.
Yeah,
they're absolutely pitiful. And we need to be able to get to the students at secondary education.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a lot of work going on there. I know the professional accounting bodies are working hard to try and provide some context and influence for students in secondary college. But I don't have the answers, I don't believe, but it's about awareness is always the most important, where there's an awareness that our Indigenous learners are not provided for appropriately. So I think that awareness is kind of much higher than it ever was. And there's also a recognition that, we don't have all the answers and we should be talking to Indigenous folk about that.
Agreed. And it's kind of, I think we are getting better at getting away from this whole one-size-fits-all approach to learning. And, you spoke about some of the trends you've kind of observed over the past 20, 30 years in terms of the growth of online. And obviously you mentioned the accessibility. Obviously this gives the opportunity for people to access learning. But I think kind of getting away from that one-size-fits-all approach and, as you say, talking to leaders across these communities to figure out, how do we make education more accessible and kind of remove some of the barriers that are stopping, these amazing kind of Indigenous kids to reach their potential.
Absolutely our responsibility. And I'm being careful with my words, but I will say it. If we put half the amount of effort into working out how we can engage with our Indigenous students as we do with our international cohort, then we'd be a long way down the track.
Completely
I think
agree.
that's fair comment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair.
Yep.
Finally, looking, into the future, what do you kind of see that's on the horizon for kind of higher education here in Australia? What do you think is going to change or needs to change, or how do you think the space is going to kind of evolve over the next 20 to 30 years?
Wow, it's a red hot issue.
Yeah.
Given the ESOS amendments that are going to Parliament in June, I think, and a lot of talk around caps on international student numbers. There's pros and cons, and that's a whole nother conversation. We won't go there, but there is a reality that both parties are looking to put caps on student numbers, international student numbers, which will absolutely impact the funding and revenue generation for universities. So there's going to be a bit of thinking about revenue generation for universities. Having said that, I was reading something recently that talked about universities being in the private property sector. I mean, universities own much property around Melbourne particularly.
Look at RMIT. Insane.
Melbourne. Yeah. So, we talk about needing money to be able to educate our students, but there's a lot of other money being invested elsewhere. I think I talked about the partnerships, which I think are very important. But again, and I probably said this in the first question, personally, I think that the main change is going to be that students may not look to do their VCE in Melbourne, 3-year undergraduate, 2-year masters, whatever else. I think learners will be more mindful of the opportunities to, again, I said before, to curate their own learning. I mean, there'll always be a role probably for a 3-year degree, which really is just evidence that someone can stick at something for 3 years. It really isn't telling you much else than that. And I know a lot of successful people who've done their 3-year degree, never done another postgraduate degree, and they're highly successful individuals. I think that word's getting out more to learners. They don't have to commit to an inflexible university structure that can be very costly. And as I said, the astute students, particularly potential postgraduate students, are looking for a return on investment.
Yeah.
So I think with technology, with global education, with smart learners, there's going to be a greater emphasis on pulling together the learning pathway that I think is going to best set me up for that job of the future.
Yeah, I can completely agree. And then it's, as you alluded to earlier, it's like I think it feels like there's a lot more urgency to change and adapt now probably than there was, like having worked, in the sector for 8 or 9 years now. It feels like that urgency is definitely there across the industry, and people are really kind of coming at it from a learner lens rather than kind of just talk to the academics, talk to the tutors, the professors. It's kind of more focused on, well, actually, what does the student need, and how do we kind of meet them on their terms?
And I think that's been encouraged by the government's quilt indicators and the performance measures for universities around student retention, student graduation, the student experience, not just enrolments, and how much research you've done. So it's really, I think the government has focused in the last 10, 15 years on the student experience, and that sort of comes through to people saying, right, we've got to give them the right experience. Highly competitive market. Higher education institutions booming at the moment. It will change, I think, given the amendments to the ESOS Act that are coming around capping students, and for higher education private providers to have 2 years onshore delivery before they invite offshore students. So there's going to be changes, but definitely the student focus is something that the government is certainly focused on, which is important. And that's what education's about.
Totally. Welcome. It's been absolutely wonderful having you on for a conversation. I've learned a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm sure our listeners also will have. For people looking to find you, is LinkedIn the best place for people to kind of reach out and have a conversation with you?
Love to.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us on Student Garden, and look forward to staying connected.
Thank you.
Cheers, Kim.
Cheers.